I think in the past, a lot of it was just very bland threat metrics, right? It was just numbers. And I think the board wants to look past that now. I think we've transitioned from purely numbers based metrics to something that's a little bit more encompassing of an entire security program.
SC Media is proud to present this month's CISO Stories program. Each month, the CISO Stories program explores a cybersecurity topic selected by Cyber Risk Alliance's CISO community and provides content that examines that topic from a variety of perspectives. Hosted by Todd Fitzgerald, best-selling author of CISO Compass, the CISO Stories weekly podcast features content powered by the 1,100-plus members of the Cyber Risk Alliance's CISO community. Listen to previous CISO Stories podcast episodes at CISOstoriespodcast.com. Cybersecurity Collaborative is a unique membership community enabling cybersecurity leaders to work together in a trusted environment. To learn more, visit CISOstoriespodcast.com/CSC. Hi, I'm your host, Todd Fitzgerald, and this week we welcome Max Shier, VP and CISO at Optiv. Welcome, Max.
Yeah, thank you. Glad to be here.
So Max, tell me, what interested you in the cybersecurity space?
You know, it's an interesting backstory. I actually came from the physical security space. I was a military police officer in the Air Force, as you could see with my background here,
Thank you for your
for 9
service.
years. And yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. It was a great time. And like I said, I was a military police officer, and I'd actually got into computers through gaming, and like a lot of others that got into computers, and found that cybersecurity, I think, was a natural transition for me, being military police and enjoying computers and fixing computers on the side. It was something that was, I think, very, very new back in 1999 when I first got into computers. And, back then it was information security. And, I was selected actually when I was working in the military to be the organizational computer manager, which as a side job is also cybersecurity for the squadron. And I was selected for that, even though I was military police, because I was fixing everybody's computers on the side. And so they thought I was a logical choice to go do this because nobody else could do it. And so that started my career within cybersecurity. I really actually didn't get into cybersecurity until I left the Air Force in 2004, finished my degree in 2005, and then really started my first cybersecurity job in 2007 when I was working for the Boeing company. So worked in the defense space for the majority of my career up until 18 months ago when I started with Optiv. And now as CISO, loving the job. I mean, cybersecurity has changed tremendously over the past couple of decades since I first started this. And I'll be honest, it's an exciting time to be in cybersecurity. It's ever changing, and especially with the advent of AI and how it's increased in popularity, both with the bad actors, but also on the cybersecurity side. I think it's a great time to be in cybersecurity, and it really excites me still.
It's a great time, and when I look at cybersecurity, I always think of all the new things that are happening. And when we wrote the CISO Compass book 5 years ago, uh, it the first chapter of that was about the evolution of the CISO role. And how what's happened in the last 30 years, and it's amazing to see all the changes that have happened, but that the role is so much more complex now because
It is.
it is the breadth and the expectations on the CISO are just so large.
Yeah, it is. And it's been interesting to watch it, I think, transition from what used to be really a technical type of role to a lot more business focused role as the CISO role becomes elevated within different corporations. And, really the CISO, as you look at it now, is really starting to take on a lot more responsibility as the government shifts who's accountable within the company for different things and the different types of regulatory requirements that CISOs are now required to meet, whether it be privacy or SEC laws with reporting now, et cetera. And so, especially over the past couple of years, the CISO role has truly elevated within companies and truly transitioned into something that really has to be wider than just a technical breadth. You really have to understand the business needs now of the company and the regulatory requirements and everything else that goes with an entire security program, not just the technical aspects of it. So it's been really interesting to see and be a part of that
Mhm.
transition.
Yeah, I mean, it really is important. And so, in talking about the role of the CISO, and today we're talking about the board, and I want to delve into some of the metrics as well, because we're talking about metrics this month is a big focus area for us. And so, what do you see as this primary role of the CISO when it comes to communicating with the board?
And that's a great question. And I think in the past, a lot of it was just very bland threat metrics, right? It was just numbers. And I think the board wants to look past that now. I think we've transitioned from purely numbers based metrics to something that's a little bit more encompassing of an entire security program. When I brief the board or when I brief senior leadership within my company, I include top security risks to the company and mitigation plans that I have with it. I have, of course, the normal metrics that we look at when it comes to security incidents and attacks on the company, et cetera. But I think what the board really wants to see is, what's the return on investment? If you are making investments, what's the expected outcomes? And lastly, transparency. You have to look at higher level trends. And if you do see risks and you do need help from the board, that you identify that for them so that way you can discuss it. And I think you have to take that opportunity when talking to the board to be able to leverage that opportunity and identify issues that you may be having that you need help with. And I think a lot of CISOs may be scared to bring those types of opportunities up when you are speaking with senior leadership because it may reflect negatively on the team or may reflect negatively on another stakeholder. But ultimately, as the accountability and regulatory requirements become more prevalent, especially as companies start becoming public, et cetera, you really need to have that transparency with the board. And I think as a CISO, you have to ensure that you are transparent with all of the stakeholders, and that includes the board. And if you do need help, that you do ask for that. You have to be transparent because the CISO is going to be the one that's held accountable if you're signing off on those regulatory documents to the government, or to any other regulatory board or compliance board. And you have to be transparent and make sure that those top risks are identified so that way you can get help in working those, or at least they're aware of what risks there are and how you're mitigating those or remediating those in the plan that's associated with it.
So how does the CISO go about determining what those key risks are for my particular organization?
And that's a good question. I think it depends. And I know that's a very government answer of me, being that I used to work for the government, but I think it really does depend. If it depends on the regulatory requirements you have and what your focus is. For me, my company's top risks are going to be a little bit different based on the threat landscape I have, the type of exposure I have, the type of work I have. And that's going to be different than, say, a financial institution, which has much more stringent banking regulations that they have to go work with. And then the risk exposure is a lot more because their internet facing exposure may be a lot more if they have, say, a banking app or, external connections to the other banking, uh, industries, et cetera. So, for me, I think you really need to look at what's the crown jewels, what's the priorities for the company as far as regulatory requirements, as far as what you're attempting or trying to protect, and then obviously building your risk posture out of that and identifying those risks based on those crown jewels. And that's going to differ depending on who you work for, right? As a defense contractor, you're looking at state sponsored actors versus, say, a healthcare industry, which is a lot more ransomware focused. And so I think your risks and risk posture is going to be dependent on what those top risks are, what industry vertical you're working in, et cetera. So I know it's a very generic answer, but it really does depend.
Isn't ransomware today a risk for every organization? Because what really
It
matters
is.
is that I
Yeah.
haven't. Yeah, I think things changed after WannaCry and NotPetya, around the 2017
Hmm.
era. That I've got data, I want it, I need it to run my business. I don't want it disclosed. Game over. I now
Right.
if I've got your data, you're going to pay me to get it back. So are there some industries that are more at risk, for the ransomware that should have that higher on their radar?
I think so. Yeah. And I would say, obviously healthcare and others that are protecting data that is, that they don't want to be released, whether that's PII or financial data, et cetera. Those are the crown jewels for those companies. And I would expect that they're going to be bigger targets for those types of ransomware type of activities. But I think, when you look at the top attacks that are prevalent today, it all centers around really the end user. Right. And I think the biggest risk for most companies is going to be the insider threat. And that insider threat is really the unintentional insider threat being the end user, because every company has employees that are going to be click happy and click on everything that they get sent, right? And so phishing is one of those things that I think is going to be the top risk for everybody. And how do you mitigate that threat of a phishing attempt on your employees or spear phishing with your executives, right? We kind of have to change how we look at those risks and really start focusing on risk factors for individual employee groups. And to your point, it's going to be dependent on what you're protecting. So, for Optiv, or any other company that doesn't work in the financial industry or medical industry, especially if you're like a defense contractor, your threat landscape is more state-sponsored actors that is trying to steal your secrets, which could be source code or plans for a new fighter jet or something like that. Whereas something like the medical industry, state-sponsored actors, maybe not so much, but cyber criminals, absolutely. And so I think for companies that work across several verticals, like my company, your threat landscape could be several different threats. And but again, to your point, I think you have to prioritize those threats and the different risks that are associated with those. And so for us, it could be state-sponsored actors as our top threat because they're good at what they do, and it's not going to be some script kiddie on the other side trying to throw some simple phishing exercises your way through utilizing AI. It's going to be very complex, sophisticated spear phishing against specific employees that they're scraping identities off of LinkedIn with, etc. And so that threat landscape is going to be a little bit different. And so again, I think it goes back to it depends on what vertical you're in, what your threat landscape looks like. And in the end, really your cyber threat intelligence feeds that you get and the other types of intel that you get need to be specific to your vertical. And if you can, try and do trends with your attacks on your company, et cetera, those other KPIs that you're providing to the board, that's where those trends are important. And I think it's important to see, when you release a news bulletin that has your company's name in it, do threats increase? Does your exposure increase? Do you see changes in attacks on your company based on the different types of media releases that you do or the acquisitions that you do, et cetera? Because that could actually change your threat landscape and the types of visibility that you're getting with different attackers. And so I like to focus a lot on cyber threat intelligence. And a lot of CISOs, I think, maybe downplay the importance of a lot of that. But if you can take cyber threat intelligence that's specific for your vertical or even your company or your companies and relate that to trends in attack data and the different types of attacks that you're getting, you can better focus the types of mitigations and remediations that you need to improve your security posture.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's an important aspect of remediation and maybe mitigation that CISOs miss.
What are some of those KPIs or those key metrics that you find that the board really likes to hear time over time?
I've seen, at least in my experience, they like the trending. So they don't want to see, you've patched 2,000 systems in the past week. To them, that's just numbers, and I don't think that it's really important for them. Now, it's important that you provide them the capability to be able to drill down into the metrics that they need to or if they want to. But I think those high level trending metrics, especially as it relates to attacks or even, security awareness training and education, if you're investing a lot of money into your security awareness program, what's the ROI on that? Is the trend improving? Do you have less people clicking on phishing links? Even if it is just an education exercise, et cetera. So trends, returns on investment, cost savings maybe that you have within your security program. leveraging efficiencies with platform plays, et cetera, or tech rationalization exercises. I think all of those are key metrics that the board likes to see versus what we traditionally saw in the past, which was, we had 3,000 attacks on our WAF this month, which is an increase of, 5%, right? That trending number increase is important. The fact that we had 3,000 attacks, maybe not so much, right? And so I think it's important for us to focus on the high level returns on investment, maybe trends and attacks that we're seeing, and then what we're doing to remediate those, I think is probably the biggest things that we can tell the board and what they're interested in.
Do you think that things with phishing simulations, we've been doing those for years now, so we have a pretty good body of knowledge, it would seem, and and we're always reporting, here's what the gap is. But so then we crank up the phishing to make them harder, and then the numbers go up again.
Right.
So how do we how do we communicate that with the board, that they aren't, I don't know how to say this, but getting tired of looking at the graph
Right.
of phishing attempts.
Yeah, and I think security awareness and education, excuse me, tongue tied this morning, is one of those things where I think the industry is changing. I think they're seeing that the traditional methods of security awareness and education maybe aren't working. Right? You send 5 phishing exercises somebody's way because they're higher risk, and so you want to test them more, and then they get testing fatigue. Right? And I think that needs to change. So, I think we see a trend in security awareness and education platforms now that talk about training the employee or, having other ways to train employees versus just sending a, blanket phishing exercise out to somebody and seeing if they click on it or report it or, just delete it. And I think that's a great way to go. So if you have somebody that is good at phishing, finishes their training on time, and they don't click the link and they report it, maybe the training exercise doesn't get sent to them for an extended period of time versus somebody that is clicking more often and needs more training and more coaching. And I think the important word there is coaching, and it's more than just slapping somebody on the hand or um, you know putting something in their file that they're click happy or that they're causing a lot of security incidents. I think there's a lot of opportunities that are missed when it comes to coaching somebody on what they should be and what they should not be doing. And we're so apt to slap them on the wrist and chastise them for doing something, but is there an underlying cause? Did they work in a career field like finance where they're getting a lot of documents that may have attachments, et cetera, that that's a part of their job, is making sure that they do look at those attachments, et cetera. So maybe the focus of the training needs to be different. And I think we also see a trend in the industry where you're seeing more focused training based on whether or not they're in a very specific career field within the company. So if they are in finance or contracts, that training is going to be a lot different than, say, a salesperson in the field or an IT individual that is working help desk. And I think that's a positive trend. And so I think, when you look at it that way, you're not sending out phishing exercises on a very consistent basis, where you're sending out to the entire company or a portion. So the percentages that you normally report to the board are going to change. And I think those metrics need to change too. And what those new metrics look like, I think that's going to be dependent on maybe the platform that you're running, because they'll generate those metrics for you over a period of time. And I still think that trend is what's important. And maybe you look at risk scores instead of normal metrics that you would look at. So many people clicked on the link. Maybe this time it's, we have risk scores associated with each employee, and we see a trending downward of risk scores based on our effective security awareness program, the fact that we do brown bag lunches to train employees on what good looks like or what bad looks like, et cetera. And that way you have a better indicator of what the overall security program looks like and whether or not your training program is effective.
So when we're talking about risk and putting that before the board, what sort of metrics do you think they're looking at today? Is it do they want to see the quantification of the risk, or are we still in this, the state of, the qualitative is good enough, or where do you see that boards are going with that?
Yeah, it's all about ROI, right? They want to know where their money is going and whether or not it's effectively spent. And I think to your point, we have to move beyond just straight metrics that include numbers. I've got attacked so many times this month. Great. But they want to see trends in where their money is going, right? And to your point, I think there's a lot of different metrics that we can look at to talk about ROI and whether or not that it's money well spent. For me, I like to identify cost savings year over year that we've leveraged as far as consolidating platforms, but then also try and quantify that in man hours saved or FTEs saved based on the amount of tickets that we may have been able to automate through SOAR capabilities or other playbooks. I think there's a lot of metrics that you can utilize to really talk about ROI and quantify that for them. But I think, quantification of that ROI is important to the board because right now they're worried about cost, right? Cybersecurity costs a lot nowadays. And I think over the past couple of years, post COVID, especially with increased interest rates and money drying up, they want to see a return on their investment, right? And if they are going to invest money, what is the ROI on that? Can you quantify that for me? What does that look like? What do I expect to get for my investment? And I think there's a huge focus on that now. And that's where those, business skills that I talked about earlier are extremely important. And how do you tell the board what that ROI is in a way that they can understand and that it's quickly digestible, right? They don't want to hear a bunch of tech jargon. What they want to know is how does it affect the business? How does it enable the business? And what is it going to cost? And what am I getting for my
Mm-hmm.
money?
I think there's we still have this thing in our industry with fear, uncertainty, and doubt, where we're
Mm.
bringing up the nation states and so forth. Is there a good way to articulate the what the risk is, um, of the nation states, against our particular environments, without going to the FUD side of the equation?
Yeah, I think so, and I think that's where those threat feeds come into play, because those threat feeds also have tactics, techniques, and protocols that those bad actors use, or TTPs, right? And I think being able to leverage those types of things into your responses, into your playbooks, etc., and be able to identify when it may be coming from a state-sponsored actor like that, and then being able to identify that for the board to show that, hey, your threat landscape has changed. We're seeing more attacks from, these bad actors from these countries. I think is important too, because the TTPs of bad actors do depends on who they are and who's attacking you, and being able to have those TTPs available to you in a threat feed is extremely important. And so I know I keep going back to cyber threat intel being an important piece of a security program, but getting the feed and being able to leverage that and integrate that into your playbooks and understanding the types of attacks that you're getting and from what groups, I think is also important. And I don't think that you have to go to the federal government to be able to get that information, although there are ways for you to get involved in information sharing with the federal government and be able to get additional intel, which is also important. I think trying to leverage multiple threat feeds or multiple ways that you can get cyber threat intel is always beneficial. So even through local groups, it doesn't have to be the federal government. It could be, your local ISSA chapter, or, like for me, I'm a part of NCMS, which is on the federal side. There's different ways to get threat intel out there that are not tied to the federal government, but also are tied to the cybersecurity community or other ways like that. And I think a CISO has to be involved in several methods of getting that threat intel. It doesn't have to be just through a paid threat feed. Networking and understanding the types of threats that are out there in that area are also important, especially as it relates to your specific vertical. And then just being involved in the community and making sure that you have people that you can reach out to see maybe what they're seeing as well.
Sure.
Um, I think that's important as a
Mhm.
CISO to build that type of network to be able to get that type of information from others that are in the industry too.
What's your view on educating the board around cybersecurity? And I ask this question because a lot of CISOs, see that as part of our role to educate the board on cybersecurity. And I had a podcast a while back with Edward Amoroso, who is the former chief security officer for AT&T, and he was saying no, it's not the CISO's job to educate the board, because when a board member is a member of a board, they're expected to understand income statements and balance sheets, and they're not teaching the CISO to
Yeah.
do that. You're expected to know that. So where do you land on the education issue?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I will say in today's environment, you have to educate the board. And reason being is you may be feeding them a ton of data and KPIs and metrics and everything that goes with it. But if they don't understand the context and how it affects the business and how it affects the risk posture of the business, I think you've failed. Like I said, I think the CISO's job is to be a translator, but that translator is also to throw in the additional context that allows the board to learn, understand the type of metrics that you're giving them or the KPIs that you're giving them, and then also understand how it affects the business. And I think what you're also seeing is if there's a push to not have the board members at least be somewhat educated in cybersecurity, they'll at least bring somebody on the board that is cybersecurity educated. So that way that person would be the focal for those types of data. And I think that's important to note too, is I think, a lot of business leaders today recognize that they may not be smart in that area. And so they're smart enough to bring somebody in that is. And, so if you have a board that isn't educated and or willing to be educated in that, maybe they are open into somebody, bringing in somebody that is educated in cybersecurity and be the focal. So that way they have the full context and then can give that information or at least make the decisions for the board that will help the company address those types of risks.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And we had early on in the CISO Stories podcast, I think it was our sixth podcast, we had Steve Katz, the late Steve Katz, who mentored many, many people, and who was also the first CISO. And he made a comment. He said that if you explain something to the board and they don't get it, they're all smart people, and it's not their fault. It's because you are too incompetent to explain it correctly. So I like how he just he played that
That's pretty blunt.
right, very blunt, right on the line. But I think we get the sentiment. Well, this has been great, Max. So before we wrap up here, what sort of advice would you give to emerging CISOs, new CISOs, current CISOs, experienced CISOs as they're trying to present metrics to the board and get
Mhm.
their investments that they need?
Well, I think the key takeaways here are, don't dig into the weeds when you're talking about metrics and the board. The board doesn't want to see that. I think most times when you go brief a board, you have just a few minutes to get your point across. And so I think the key points that you need to identify for them are key risks to the company or to the business, or top risks, how you're mitigating them, and remediation plans and timelines. High level trends of attack data, security awareness and training data, and other metrics that the board feels is important for them to know. And, you know, keep it transparent, right? Ask the board what type of metrics are important to you. Don't guess. Talk to them about it. What do you want to see from me? What's important to you? And I can get you the data, right? And have that two-way conversation. It shouldn't just be you feeding data to the board. It should be a two-way street. And then just making sure that you bring up issues that you may be having that you need help with, and keep that transparency and keep that two-way communication. When you have that ability to brief the board, leverage it, right? Give them the information they want. Also identify risks and trends that they may want to see and that are important to you to make sure that they understand. So that way, if there is an issue that comes up, they're well aware of it before it gets to them, right? It should not be all of a sudden become a crisis at their level if it's been an ongoing issue for you for several months. And I think that's the big point here is when you have the opportunity to brief the board, high level transparency, identify risks and issues, give them an action plan, and then make sure that you identify trends. And if you have the opportunity, identify ROI for them. So that way, when they are investing money, you give them the key metrics and other information that shows that you're spending that money wisely and that they're getting a return on their investment. And I appreciate you allowing me to come on the show. It's been a great discussion.
That's excellent advice. Lots of great takeaways here. So thanks a lot, Max.
Yeah, thank you, Todd. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for tuning in for this week's episode of the CISO Stories podcast. Please subscribe to the CISO Stories podcast and you will receive a new story each Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. We'll see you next week for a new episode.